The officer's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade across silk. "Hey, you, move it along." The old man, sitting on the stone bench at the edge of the veterans' cemetery, did not turn around. His eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, on a wall of black granite where names had been carved into eternity. The officer walked closer, boots crunching against the gravel pathway, his shadow falling across the hunched figure in the worn army jacket. "I said move. Did you hear me?" Still the old man did not respond. His hands, weathered and scarred in ways that told stories no one had bothered to ask about, rested motionless on his knees. What Officer Bradley Caston did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he stood there with his hand already drifting toward his radio, was that in exactly 23 minutes he would be on his knees in this same spot, tears streaming down his face, facing a man whose name was carved into the dedication plaque of the very memorial he was trying to protect. The May morning had begun like any other at the Riverside Veterans Memorial Cemetery. Groundskeeper Harold Brennan had unlocked the gates at 6, just as he had done for the past 20 years. The flags had been raised to full staff in honor of Memorial Day. The maintenance crew had begun setting up folding chairs near the main pavilion where the ceremony would take place that afternoon. And the old man had been there waiting, just as he always was, sitting on the same bench he had claimed as his own 6 years ago. Caston adjusted his belt and stepped directly in front of the bench, blocking the old man's view of the memorial wall. His partner, Officer Darnell Washington, hung back near their patrol car, arms crossed, watching the interaction with an expression that was difficult to read. "Sir," Caston said, though the word carried no respect in it, "this is your final warning. The mayor is arriving in 2 hours. General Chin's motorcade will be here in less than 1. We cannot have vagrants loitering at the entrance to a Memorial Day ceremony. It sends the wrong message." The old man finally looked up. His face was a landscape of years and weather, deep lines carved around eyes that held something Caston did not recognize because he had never seen it before. It was the look of a man who had witnessed things that could not be unseen, carried weights that could not be set down, and walked through fires that had burned away everything except the essential core of who he was. His voice, when it came, was soft as ash. "I understand, sir. I will move shortly. I just need to finish speaking with my friend." Caston's laugh was sharp and performative, meant to be heard by the ceremony workers who had paused their setup to watch. "Your friend, right? Let me guess. One of the dead guys on that wall?" He gestured dismissively toward the granite memorial. "That is genuinely pathetic, old man. You know that. Coming here to talk to names on a rock." Something flickered in the old man's eyes. Not anger. Something deeper. Something that had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he could not afford. His scarred hands lifted slowly from his knees, and for just a moment his fingers touched something beneath his jacket, something that rested against his chest, hidden from view. The morning light caught the edge of his sleeve as it rode up, revealing more scars, burn marks that wrapped around his forearms in patterns that suggested heat and desperation and acts performed without thought for personal safety. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one, about courage and sacrifice and the heroes hidden among us, speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible, true stories that honor the forgotten warriors in our midst. Now let us continue. Darnell Washington shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Something about this situation was bothering him, though he could not quite identify what. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marine Corps before joining the police force, and there was something about the way this old man held himself that felt familiar. The economy of his movements, the way he had straightened almost imperceptibly when Caston first addressed him, the automatic use of the word sir, even while being insulted. These were not the mannerisms of a vagrant. These are the marks of training so deeply ingrained that decades of hardship could not erase them. Caston was still talking, his voice growing louder as more workers gathered to watch. "Do you have any identification? Any proof you were supposed to be here?" Because I have been a police officer for 4 years, and I have seen 100 guys like you claiming to be veterans, claiming to have served, when really you just want a handout and a warm place to sleep. He leaned closer, close enough that the old man could smell the coffee on his breath. So let me ask you directly, did you even serve? Or is that jacket just something you pulled out a donation bin? The old man's response was barely audible. A long time ago, somewhere that does not exist on any map anymore. Caston snorted. Right? Very mysterious. Very dramatic. He pulled out his citation book with theatrical flourish. I'm going to write you up for trespassing. And when General Chan arrives and sees that we have kept the riffraff away from her precious ceremony, maybe I will finally get noticed for doing my job properly. Darnell took a step forward. Bradley, maybe we should just let him finish his visit. It is Memorial Day. The man is clearly not hurting anyone. Caston spun around, irritation flashing across his face. Do not go soft on me, Washington. You know what the captain said. This ceremony has to be perfect. No distractions. No embarrassments. And this, he gestured at the old man like he was pointing at garbage that needed removal. This is exactly the kind of embarrassment we were told to prevent. 50 yards away, Harold Brennan set down his rake and began walking toward the confrontation. His weathered face was tight with concern, and his pace quickened with each step. He had watched this old man come to the cemetery every single morning for 6 years. He had seen him trace the names on the wall with trembling fingers. He had heard him whisper conversations with the dead that would break your heart if you listened too closely. And he knew something about this man that Officer Bradley Caston was about to learn in the hardest possible way. The old man slowly rose from the bench. His movements were stiff, his left leg dragging slightly in a way that suggested old damage that had never fully healed. As he stood, his jacket shifted, and something beneath his shirt caught the light. Just a glint, just a flash of pale blue and silver. Then it was gone, hidden again beneath layers of worn fabric. He looked at Caston with those ancient, knowing eyes. I have been walking for 6 years, son. I'm tired, but I will go. I just need one more minute with West. That is all I'm asking. One more minute to tell him I'm still here. Caston's patience evaporated entirely. He reached for his radio, thumb pressing the transmit button. This is Unit 7. I am removing a vagrant from the memorial entrance. Requesting acknowledgement. The radio crackled with confirmation, and Caston allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. There. Now it is official. He turned back to the old man. You have 60 seconds to start walking toward that exit, or I am placing you under arrest for criminal trespass. Your choice. Harold Brennan broke into a jog, waving his arms. Officer, wait. You do not understand who you are talking to. But Caston was not listening. His attention was fixed on the old man, on this vagrant who had dared to make his mourning difficult, who stood between him and the recognition he so desperately craved. He did not see the look that passed between Darnell and Harold. He did not notice the way his partner's face had gone pale. He did not feel the shift in the morning air as something enormous and terrible began to unfold. All he saw was an obstacle to be removed. And in exactly 19 minutes, that blindness would cost him everything. 6 years ago, Ezekiel Thornberry had been a different man. He had lived in a small house on Maple Street with yellow shutters and a garden that his wife Ruth had tended with the same devotion she brought to everything she loved. There had been photographs on the walls, medals in a shadow box that he never looked at, a life that, while haunted by memories he could not escape, had at least been a life. Then the cancer came, and then Ruth was gone, and then the walls of that yellow house began to close in around him like the walls of a tomb. He had sold everything within 3 months of her funeral. The house, the furniture, the car. He had given the money to veterans organizations, every last dollar, because money meant nothing to a man who had lost the only person capable of making him feel human. He had kept only 3 things. The ring Ruth had worn for 47 years, which now hung on a chain against his chest beside the medal he had never wanted. The photograph of his unit taken 2 days before Hamburger Hill, 7 young faces smiling at the camera with no idea that 5 of them would never smile again. And the worn Bible that Ruth had given him when he came home from the war, the one with her handwriting in the margins, her notes of encouragement, her prayers for his wounded soul. The morning of Memorial Day had begun the same way every morning began. Ezekiel had risen before dawn from the spot beneath the oak tree where he slept when the weather was warm. He had walked the 3 miles to the cemetery in boots held together with duct tape and willpower. He had waited at the gates until Harold Brennan arrived to unlock them, exchanging the same silent nod they had shared every morning for 6 years. And then he had begun his ritual. First, he visited Ruth. Her grave was on the eastern slope, where the morning sun would touch the headstone before anywhere else in the cemetery. He had chosen that spot himself, had paid for it with the last money he kept before giving everything else away. He knelt before her marker and spoke to her the way he had spoken to her every day of their marriage. "Good morning, sweetheart. Beautiful day. Going to be hot later. The ceremony is today. A lot of people coming. I will stay out of the way." He paused, his throat tightening. "I miss you, Ruth. Every single day. You were the only one who understood. The only one who could make the noise stop." His fingers traced the letters of her name, carved into granite. "I am trying. I am still trying. Just like I promised." After Ruth, he walked to the memorial wall. This was the harder visit. The wall contained the names of every service member from the county who had died in combat since World War I. There were hundreds of names, but Ezekiel only looked at 7. They were grouped together near the center of the wall. The men of his squad who had not come home from a mountain in Vietnam that the maps called APBia, but that the soldiers who fought there simply called hell. Wesley Drummond was first among them. West, the kid from Alabama who could not stop singing, who had a voice like honey and a laugh that could make you forget you were 10,000 miles from home in a jungle that wanted you dead. West had been the point man. West had been his best friend. And West had died in his arms on the 10th day of a battle that should have lasted 2. Ezekiel pressed his palm flat against the wall, feeling the cool granite beneath his scarred skin. "Still here, brother," he whispered. "Still trying. Like you told me. Every day I come here, and I tell you I'm still trying." His voice cracked. "I know you said to live. I know that was your order. But living is hard, West. Living is so hard when everyone you love is on the other side." He stayed like that for a long time, palm against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slowly. The sun climbed higher. The ceremony workers arrived and began their preparations. And Ezekiel remained at the wall, speaking names that only the dead could hear, keeping promises that only he remembered making. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. They always did when he stood at this wall. May of 1969. The orders coming down to take Hill 937. Everyone knew it was suicide. The North Vietnamese had dug in deep, had fortified every approach, had turned that mountain into a fortress of death. But orders were orders, and the men of the 101st Airborne did not question orders. They followed them, even into hell. The first assault had been a disaster. The second was worse. By the 3rd day, Ezekiel's squad had taken casualties they could not afford. By the 5th day, they were fighting for survival rather than victory. And on the 10th day, everything fell apart completely. He remembered the sound of the RPG before he saw it. That distinctive whoosh that meant death was coming, and you had exactly 1 second to react. He had thrown himself sideways, had felt the heat of the explosion wash over him, had tasted copper and smoke and terror. And when he looked up, 11 men from his company were scattered across the hillside, wounded, bleeding, dying. The memory of what came next was burned into his mind with the same permanence as the scars on his arms. He had not thought. He had not calculated odds or considered consequences. He had simply moved, first to Private Patterson, dragging him 60 yards through enemy fire to the medic station, then back for Corporal Williams, then Sergeant Okonkwo, then Shun, the quiet kid from San Francisco who wrote letters to his baby daughter every night. 11 trips across a killing field. 11 times he had exposed himself to fire that should have cut him down. 11 men he had carried on his shoulders while bullets snapped past his head and mortars exploded close enough to knock him off his feet. His arms had burned from carrying their weight. His lungs had burned from breathing smoke and cordite. And through it all, one thought had driven him forward. Get them home. Get them all home. But he could not get West. Every time he finished a carry, he looked for West, tried to reach West, but the fire was too heavy, the distance too great, and there were always more wounded men closer who needed him first. By the time he finally reached the spot where West had fallen, his best friend was bleeding out from a severed femoral artery, and there was nothing anyone could do except hold him and listen to his final words. You carried 11 men today, Zeke. West's voice had been barely a whisper, his life draining into the mud of that godforsaken hillside. Now, carry yourself. Live. That is an order. Then his eyes had gone still, and something inside Ezekiel Thornberry had broken in a way that 55 years of living had never managed to repair. The sound of boots on gravel pulled him back to the present. He turned to see the young officer approaching, the one with the hard eyes and the chip on his shoulder. Behind him, another officer hung back, watching, and beyond them both, Harold Brennan was moving with unusual speed, his weathered face tight with concern. Ezekiel looked at the wall one more time, at West's name, at the names of the other 6 who had not come home. I have to go now, brothers, he said softly. Someone wants me to leave, but I will be back tomorrow. I'm always back tomorrow. He turned to face whatever was coming. His hand drifted unconsciously to his chest, to the weight that hung there, the burden he had carried for 5 decades. The metal that reminded him every single day of the man he could not save. The honor that felt like a curse. The recognition for heroism that had cost him everything that mattered. The young officer was shouting now, something about vagrants and ceremonies and proper procedure. But Ezekiel barely heard him. All he could hear was West's voice, fading into memory, giving him an order he had never quite managed to follow. Live. That is an order. 55 years later, he was still trying to figure out how. Officer Bradley Caston had been waiting his entire career for a day like this. The mayor was coming. A 2-star general was coming. The local news crews were already setting up their cameras near the pavilion. This was the kind of event where a sharp young officer could get noticed, could catch the eye of someone important, could finally start climbing the ladder he had been eyeing since the day he graduated from the academy. And nothing, certainly not some homeless vagrant with delusions of friendship with the dead, was going to stand in his way. He planted himself directly in front of the old man, close enough to establish dominance, close enough to make his authority unmistakable. I thought I made myself clear. You have 60 seconds. Starting now. He made a show of checking his watch. 55, 54, 53. The old man looked at him with those unsettling eyes, the ones that seemed to see straight through the uniform and the badge and the bluster to something underneath. I meant no disrespect, officer. I come here every day. I will leave quietly. I just needed to say goodbye. Goodbye. Caston laughed, and the sound carried across the cemetery grounds, drawing more attention from the workers who had stopped their preparations to watch. You needed to say goodbye to a wall, to names carved in rock. He shook his head with theatrical disbelief. Do you have any idea how crazy that sounds? Do you understand why normal people find that disturbing? From his position near the patrol car, Darnell Washington felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen plenty of confrontations during his time on the force, had witnessed his partner's aggressive style more times than he could count. But something about this particular interaction was setting off alarms in his head. The old man's bearing, the way he stood even now, even while being humiliated with his shoulders back and his chin level. The automatic deference in his voice that spoke of decades of discipline. These were not the marks of a vagrant. These were the marks of something else entirely. Bradley, he called out. Maybe we should just escort him to the exit. No need to make a scene. Caston turned, irritation flashing across his features. A scene? I'm not making a scene. He is making a scene by being here. By squatting at the entrance to a memorial ceremony like some kind of human speed bump. He turned back to the old man. 40 seconds. 39. 38. The ceremony workers had fully stopped now. A woman holding a clipboard stood frozen near the pavilion. 2 men carrying folding chairs had set them down to watch. Even the news crew had noticed the commotion and was debating whether to start filming early. The confrontation had become a spectacle, which was exactly what Caston wanted. Witnesses to his authority. Proof that he could handle difficult situations with decisive action. Harold Brennan finally reached them, slightly out of breath from his hurried walk across the grounds. "Officer, please." He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "This man is not causing any trouble. He comes here every single day. He has been coming here longer than you have been on the force." Caston barely glanced at him. "And that is supposed to make trespassing acceptable? He has no permit. Nobu Citizen. No legitimate reason to be here." He turned back to the old man. 25 seconds. "I suggest you start walking." The old man did not move. His eyes had drifted back to the memorial wall, to the names that only he could read from this distance, because he had memorized their exact positions years ago. West was third from the left in the 7th row. Next to him was Patterson, the kid from Ohio who had cried for his mother while Ezekiel carried him to safety. Next to Patterson was Williams, who had taken 3 bullets in the chest and somehow survived the carry, only to die on the medevac helicopter 10 minutes later. "I carried them," the old man said quietly. His voice was so soft that Caston had to lean in to hear him. "I carried every single one of them off that mountain, and I have been carrying them ever since." Caston's expression twisted into something ugly. "Oh, here we go. The war stories. Let me guess. You were Special Forces. You saved 100 men. You have medals hidden somewhere that prove you are a big hero." He stepped even closer, his face inches from the old man's. "I have heard all before, buddy. Every homeless vet in this city has the same story. You are all heroes. You all saved the world. And yet here you are, living on the streets, begging for change, making the rest of us clean up your mess." Darnell moved closer, his unease growing with every word his partner spoke. He found himself studying the old man's hands, the patterns of scarring that wrapped around his forearms and disappeared beneath his sleeves. Those were not defensive wounds. Those were not the marks of street fights or accidents. Those were burn scars, the kind you got from reaching in a fire, from grabbing metal that was too hot to touch, from doing things that should have killed you, but somehow did not. "Bradley," he said again, more urgently this time, "we should back off. Something is not right here." Caston ignored him. His countdown had reached 0, and the old man had not moved. That was the excuse he needed. "All right, that is it. You're under arrest for criminal trespass." He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The old man finally looked directly at him. There was no fear in his eyes. No anger. Just a deep, profound weariness that seemed to stretch back decades. "Son," he said quietly, "I have faced things that would turn your hair white. I have held dying men in my arms and promised them I would never forget. I have walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing but scars and memories." He paused. "You can arrest me if you need to. You can take me anywhere you want. But I will be back here tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until I am buried next to them. Because that is my duty. That is my promise. And I do not break my promises." Something in his voice made Caston hesitate. Just for a moment. Just long enough for doubt to flicker across his face. Then he shoved it down, buried it beneath his ambition and his pride and his desperate need to be seen as someone important. "Turn around," he repeated. "Now." The old man turned slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the movements of someone who had been trained to remain calm under pressure. As he brought his hands behind his back, his jacket shifted. The worn fabric pulled tight across his chest, and something caught the light. Darnell saw it first. A flash of pale blue, a glint of silver, something hanging against the old man's chest on a chain, hidden beneath his shirt, now partially visible through the gap in his jacket. His breath caught in his throat. His Marine Corps training screamed at him, telling him what that color meant, what that shape suggested, what kind of man wore that particular ribbon against his heart. "No," he whispered. "That is not possible." Harold Brennan stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Officer, before you do anything else, you need to know who you are talking to." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, something he had been carrying for 6 years, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. "His name is Ezekiel Thornberry. Sergeant Major, United States Army, 101st Airborne Division. He unfolded the paper with shaking hands. And if you look at the dedication plaque of this memorial, the one you are supposed to be protecting today, you will see his name. Because this man did not just serve his country. He helped build this place. He helped design this wall. And half the names carved into that granite are men he personally tried to save. Caston's hand froze on his handcuffs. The color began to drain from his face. But he was not looking at Harold. He was not looking at the paper. He was looking at his partner, at Darnell Washington, who had fallen completely still, whose eyes were fixed on the old man's chest, whose face had gone pale as ash. Washington, Caston said slowly, "What is it? What are you looking at?" Darnell's voice came out as barely a whisper. "That ribbon. That medal. Bradley, do you know what that is? Do you have any idea what you have done?" The screaming eagle had been tattooed on his shoulder 56 years ago in a cramped parlor outside Fort Campbell. Ezekiel remembered the pain of the needle, the buzz of the machine, the way the artist had steadied his hand with the focus of a surgeon. The 101st Airborne Division. The legendary soldiers who had dropped into Normandy, who had held Bastogne, who had jumped into every major conflict since World War II with nothing but courage and the absolute certainty that they would either complete their mission or die trying. He had been 22 years old when that eagle was inked into his skin. He had been young and invincible and stupid enough to believe that war was something you survived and then left behind. Beneath the eagle, 7 names have been added over the years, each one etched in smaller letters. Each one representing a man who would never grow old, never hold his children, never sit on a porch and watch the sunset with his wife. Wesley Drummond, Thomas Patterson, Marcus Williams, Robert Chun, David Okonkwo, James Whitfield, Samuel Torres, his brothers, his responsibility, his eternal burden. The memory of how they had come together was sharper than any knife. Basic training at Fort Benning, where drill sergeants had broken them down and rebuilt them into something harder, something capable of enduring what was coming. Jump school, where they had learned to throw themselves out of perfectly good airplanes and trust that the silk above their heads would carry them safely to Earth. And finally, Vietnam, where everything they had learned was tested against an enemy who knew the jungle better than they knew their own backyards. West had been the first to approach him. It was their 3rd day in country, and Ezekiel had been sitting alone outside the barracks, writing a letter to Ruth that he was not sure he would ever be able to send. The kid from Alabama had dropped down beside him without invitation, pulled out a harmonica, and started playing a tune so sweet and sad that Ezekiel had stopped writing mid-sentence just to listen. "You play well," he had said when the song ended. West had grinned, that wide, easy smile that could light up a room even in the middle of a war zone. "My daddy taught me. Said music was the only thing that could keep a man sane when the world went crazy." He had tucked the harmonica back into his pocket. "You writing to your girl?" "My wife, Ruth." West had whistled low and impressed. "Married man. How long?" 2 years. "She pretty?" Ezekiel had smiled despite himself. "Prettiest woman in Tennessee." "Well then." West had slapped him on the shoulder with an easy familiarity that should have been annoying, but somehow was not. "You got something worth coming home to. That means you and me, we're going to be friends. Because I plan to make sure every married man in this unit gets back to his wife. It is my personal mission." They had been inseparable after that. West and Zeke, the singer and the soldier, the optimist and the realist. They had watched each other's backs through firefights and ambushes and long nights when the darkness pressed in so heavy it felt like it would crush them. They had shared letters from home, photographs of loved ones, dreams of what they would do when the war was over. West was going to open a music store in Birmingham. Ezekiel was going to build Ruth that farmhouse she always talked about, the one with the wraparound porch and the view of the mountains. Neither of those things had happened. The war had made sure of that. The orders for Hamburger Hill had come down on May 10th, 1969. Take Hill 937. Neutralize enemy positions. Secure the summit. Simple words for an impossible task. The North Vietnamese had fortified that mountain for months, had turned it into a death trap of bunkers and tunnels and overlapping fields of fire. Intelligence estimated a regiment. The reality was closer to 3. The first assault had cost them 15 men. The second, 20 more. By the third day, the hill had earned its nickname. By the fifth day, they were fighting just to hold the ground they had already paid for in blood. And through it all, Wessex kept singing, quietly, under his breath, humming melodies that reminded them they were still human, still alive, still capable of something other than killing. On the morning of May 20th, the final push began. Ezekiel's squad was positioned on the eastern slope, tasked with providing cover fire while another unit attempted to flank the main bunker complex. The plan fell apart within minutes. An artillery barrage that was supposed to soften enemy positions fell short, scattering the flanking unit and leaving Ezekiel's squad exposed on open ground. The RPG that started everything came from Spiderhole they had missed during their advance. Ezekiel heard the whoosh, felt the heat, tasted the dirt and smoke as the explosion threw him sideways. When his vision cleared, 11 men were down, scattered across the hillside like broken dolls. Some screaming, some silent, all of them dying. He did not remember making a decision. There was no moment of calculation, no weighing of risks versus rewards. There was only movement, only action, only the absolute certainty that he would not leave his brothers to die alone on that hill. Patterson first, the kid from Ohio who had shown him pictures of his newborn daughter just that morning. Ezekiel grabbed him under the arms and dragged him 60 yards through fire so heavy the air itself seemed to be burning. Then back for Williams, who was cursing and praying in equal measure as blood poured from the holes in his chest. Then Okonkwo, who had gone silent and pale, his dark skin turning gray from shock and blood loss. 3 carries, then 4, then 5. The enemy fire never stopped. Bullets snapped past his head close enough to feel the wind of their passage. Mortars exploded so near that the concussions knocked him flat twice. His arms burned. His lungs burned. His legs burned. Everything burned, but he kept moving, kept dragging, kept carrying because stopping meant watching him die. 6, 7, 8. Each trip across that killing field was supposed to be his last. Each time he rose to go back, he was certain he would not make it 10 feet before the bullets found him. But they never did. Somehow, impossibly, they never did. 9, 10, 11. Chin was the last one he could reach, the quiet kid from San Francisco who wrote to his baby daughter every night. Ezekiel carried him nearly 100 yards, both of them covered in so much blood he could not tell whose was whose. And through it all, he could see West. 50 yards away, behind a fallen log, not moving, he could see his best friend lying there. And he could not get to him, could not reach him, because there were always more wounded men closer who needed him first. When he finally made it to West, the sun was starting to set. The fire had slackened enough to allow movement. And West was still alive. Barely. His leg was shattered. His femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel. He had been lying there for hours, watching Ezekiel save everyone else, bleeding out slowly into the mud. Zeke. His voice was barely a whisper. You came. Ezekiel gathered him up, tried to stop the bleeding, knew with terrible certainty that it was too late. I am here, brother. I am here. You carried 11 men today. West's eyes were already starting to glaze. Now carry yourself. Live. That is an order. Then he was gone, and Ezekiel was alone on that hillside, holding the body of his best friend, surrounded by the dead and the dying. And something inside him shattered so completely that 55 years had not been enough to put the pieces back together. The sound of Darnell's voice pulled him back to the present. That ribbon, the young officer was saying. That medal. Bradley, do you know what that is? Ezekiel closed his eyes. The weight against his chest felt heavier than ever. The weight of honor. The weight of loss. The weight of a promise he had never quite managed to keep. Still here, brother, he whispered to no one. Still trying. Darnell Washington had been 19 years old the first time he saw a Medal of Honor. It had been at Camp Lejeune during a ceremony honoring veterans of past conflicts, and the recipient had been a frail man in his 80s who needed help walking to the podium. But when that man had stood before the assembled Marines, when the pale blue ribbon with its 5 white stars had caught the light, Every single person in that auditorium had risen to their feet. Not because they were ordered to, because they understood what that medal meant. Because they knew that fewer than 4,000 men in the entire history of the United States had ever worn it. Because the Medal of Honor was not given for bravery. It was given for acts of valor so extraordinary, so far beyond the call of duty, that they defied comprehension. Now, standing in a veteran's cemetery on Memorial Day morning, Darnell felt his training screaming at him. The pale blue ribbon visible through the gap in the old man's jacket. The distinctive shape of the medal itself, partially obscured but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The five-pointed star hanging from a bar of the same pale blue, the same configuration that had been worn by recipients since the Civil War. "Bradley," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stop. You need to stop right now." Caston turned, irritation and confusion warring on his face. "What is your problem, Washington? I am handling this." "You are not handling anything." Darnell stepped forward, positioning himself between his partner and the old man. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, could feel the weight of what he was witnessing pressing down on him like a physical force. "Do you see what he is wearing? Do you have any idea what that ribbon means?" Caston glanced at the old man's chest, at the glimpse of pale blue visible through his worn jacket. "So he has some ribbon. So what? These guys collect medals from surplus stores all the time. Stolen valor is practically an epidemic." "That is not stolen," Darnell said, and his voice cracked on the words. "That is not from a surplus store. That is the Medal of Honor. The actual Medal of Honor. And if this man is wearing it, then he is one of maybe 65 living recipients in the entire country." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ceremony workers who had been watching from a distance seemed to hold their breath. Harold Brennan stood frozen with the folded paper still in his hands, his eyes wet with tears he was not bothering to hide. And Caston, for the first time since the confrontation began, looked genuinely uncertain. "That is impossible," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "He is homeless. He lives on the street. The Medal of Honor recipients get pensions. They get benefits. They get taken care of." Darnell shook his head slowly. "You do not understand. You do not understand anything about what these men went through, what they saw, what they carry." He turned to face the old man, and when he spoke again, his voice held the formal cadence of military protocol. "Sir, Sergeant Major Thornberry, if that is truly who you are, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the United States Marine Corps. I studied your action at Hamburger Hill during my training at Camp Lejeune." He paused, struggling to keep his composure. "Every Marine knows what you did on that mountain. Every soldier, every sailor, every airman. Your name is in the textbooks, sir. Your action is taught as an example of what courage looks like when it has no limits." The old man looked at him with those ancient, haunted eyes, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not pride, not satisfaction, something closer to pain. "What is your name, son?" "Darnell Washington, sir. Lance Corporal, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." "You serve in Helmand?" "Yes, sir." "Sanjin and Marja." The old man nodded slowly. "Bad country. Worse than the jungle in some ways." He paused. "Did you lose anyone?" The question hit Darnell like a physical blow. He had to look away, had to blink back the sudden burning in his eyes. "4, sir. 4 men from my unit." "Then you understand." "Yes, sir. I understand." They stood there for a moment, 2 veterans separated by 50 years and 10,000 miles, connected by a grief that only those who had carried it could comprehend. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. The flags rippled in a breeze that carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass and something else, something older, something that might have been memory. Harold Brennan finally found his voice. He has been coming here every day for 6 years. Every single day, rain or shine, summer or winter. He visits his wife's grave first. Then he comes to the wall. He talks to them like they are still alive, like they can hear him. His voice trembled. I have left food for him, water, blankets in the winter. He never asks for anything, never complains. Just comes here to keep his promise. What promise? Darnell asked softly. The old man answered for himself. I promised them I would never forget. I promised I would come back every day and tell them I was still trying, that I had not given up. His scarred hands moved to his chest, touching the weight that hung there. Wes gave me an order before he died. He told me to live. He looked at Darnell with an expression that seemed to contain every sorrow the world had ever known. I have been trying to follow that order for 55 years. Some days it is the hardest thing I have ever done. Caston had gone pale. His hand had fallen away from his handcuffs. The arrogance that had defined him throughout the confrontation had evaporated, replaced by something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine shame. I did not know, he said weakly. How was I supposed to know? You were not, the old man replied quietly. That is the point, son. You see a homeless man, and you see a problem to be solved, a nuisance to be removed. You do not see the years of service, the brothers lost, the weight we carry that never gets lighter. He turned to look at the memorial wall, at the names carved into granite. Every veteran you pass on these streets might be carrying something like this, something that broke them in ways that cannot be fixed, something that cost them everything except their memories. Do not judge. Do not assume. Just remember that once we carried a weight for you, and some of us are still carrying it. The sound of car doors closing echoed across the cemetery grounds. Darnell turned to see a black SUV with government plates pulling into the parking area near the pavilion. Behind it, 2 more vehicles followed in precise formation. The motorcade had arrived early. A woman in army dress uniform emerged from the lead vehicle. 2 stars gleamed on her shoulders. Her bearing was rigid, her stride purposeful, her presence commanding in a way that drew every eye in the vicinity. She began walking toward the pavilion, flanked by aides and security personnel, clearly intent on inspecting the ceremony preparations. Then she stopped. Her eyes had found the small group gathered near the memorial wall. The 2 police officers, the groundskeeper, and the old man in the worn jacket, standing with his hands at his sides, his scarred face turned toward the morning sun. She changed direction immediately. Her aides scrambled to keep up. Her security detail exchanged confused glances but followed without question. And as she drew closer, as her features became clear in the morning light, Darnell saw something in her expression that he had never expected to see on the face of a 2-star general. Recognition and tears. General Margaretson had been 7 years old the first time she heard the name Ezekiel Thornberry. Her father had been sitting in his wheelchair on the back porch of their house in San Francisco, watching the fog roll in from the bay, and he had been crying. She had never seen her father cry before. He was a strong man, a proud man, a man who had lost both legs below the knee in a war she was too young to understand, but who never complained, never showed weakness, never let anyone see the cost of his sacrifice. But that evening, he had been crying, and when she asked him why, he had pulled her onto his lap and told her about a mountain in Vietnam, about a battle that should have killed him, about a man who had carried him nearly 100 yards through enemy fire, who had saved his life at the risk of his own, who had gone back again and again into a killing field that no sane person would have entered once. His name was Ezekiel, her father had said. We called him Zeke. He carried 11 of us off that mountain, Maggie. 11 men who would have died in the mud if not for him. And when they gave him the Medal of Honor, he did not want to accept it. He said he did not deserve it because he could not save everyone, because his best friend died in his arms while he was saving the rest of us. Her father had made her promise that day. If you ever meet him, Maggie, if you ever have a chance, you tell him that Robertson lived a full life because of what he did. You tell him I got to see my daughter grow up. You tell him I got to hold my grandchildren. And you tell him that Wes will be proud of him, that we are all proud of him, that he carried us off that mountain, and he has been carrying us ever since, and it is time for him to put that weight down. Robertson had died 11 years ago, peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and the life that Ezekiel Thornberry had made possible. And Margaretson had carried her father's message with her every day since, waiting for the chance to deliver it, hoping against hope that someday she would find the man who had given her father back to her. Now she was walking across a cemetery lawn on Memorial Day morning, her heart pounding so hard she could feel in her throat, her eyes fixed on a figure she had only ever seen in grainy photographs from 50 years ago. He was older now, weathered by decades of pain she could only imagine. His clothes were worn, his frame thinner than the powerful young soldier in the pictures her father had kept. But his bearing was unmistakable. The way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the quiet dignity that radiated from him even now, even surrounded by police officers and confrontation. She stopped 10 feet away from him. Her aides stopped behind her, confused by her sudden change of direction. The security detail fanned out, assessing the situation with professional wariness. And the old man slowly turned to face her, his ancient eyes meeting hers with an expression of weary resignation. Then recognition flickered across his features. Something in the shape of her face. Something in the way she held herself. Something that connected across 50 years to a young soldier he had carried through hell. "Chun," he said softly. "Robert's daughter." General Margaret Chun felt the tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She did not care that her aides were watching. She did not care that the police officers were staring. She did not care that she was a 2-star general crying in public on the most important day of her ceremonial calendar. None of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the man standing before her and the message she had waited half her life to deliver. "Little Maggie," the old man continued, and his voice cracked on the words. "You grew up. You became a general." He shook his head slowly, wonder breaking through the weariness. "Robert would be so proud." "He was proud," she managed. "He talked about you until the day he died, Sergeant Major. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, every time someone asked about his legs or his service, he told them about the man who carried him off Hamburger Hill. He told them about Ezekiel Thornberry. And he made me promise that if I ever found you, I would tell you something." The old man waited. His scarred hands were trembling slightly at his sides. His eyes, those ancient haunted eyes, held a flicker of something that might have been fear. Fear of what she would say. Fear of forgiveness he did not believe he deserved. "He wanted me to tell you that he lived a full life because of what you did. That he got to see his daughter grow up. That he got to hold his grandchildren." Her voice was shaking now, the words tumbling out through tears and decades of waiting. "He wanted me to tell you that West would be proud of you. That all of them will be proud of you. That you carried them off that mountain, and you have been carrying them ever since, and it is time to put that weight down." The silence that followed was sacred, holy in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the connection between those who had served and those who understood what service truly cost. Officer Caston had backed away, his face pale, his arrogance completely shattered. Darnell Washington stood at attention without being ordered to, tears streaming openly down his cheeks. Harold Brennan had removed his cap and was holding it against his chest. Even the ceremony workers had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The old man did not speak for a long moment. His lips moved silently, forming words that might have been prayers or might have been conversations with men who had been dead for half a century. Then he looked at General Chun with an expression that seemed to hold every sorrow and every hope the world had ever known. "I tried to reach him," he said, his voice barely audible. "West. I tried so hard to get to him, but there were always more wounded men closer. Always someone else who needed me first. By the time I got to him, it was too late. I held him while he died. I listened to him tell me to live, and I have been trying to follow that order ever since. But living is hard, General. Living is so hard when everyone you love is on the other side." General Chun closed the distance between them. She did not ask permission. She did not hesitate. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the old man in the worn jacket, the homeless veteran who had saved her father, the Medal of Honor recipient who had spent 6 years sleeping under trees and talking to the dead because he could not forgive himself for not saving everyone. "You followed that order," she whispered into his shoulder. "You lived, and now it is time to stop just surviving and start living again. Not for West, not for my father, for yourself, because you deserve it, because 55 years of penance is enough." She felt him shaking in her arms. felt the sobs breaking through decades of stoicism and guilt and pain held so tightly it had become part of his bones. Felt the weight he had been carrying finally, impossibly, beginning to shift. Behind them, the sun climbed higher over the veterans' cemetery. The flags rippled in the morning breeze, and the names on the memorial wall seemed to shimmer in the light. 7 names among hundreds, 7 men who had given everything, watching over the brother who had carried them home. The embrace lasted longer than military protocol would have allowed. General Chen did not care. She held the old man as he trembled, as 55 years of grief and guilt and loneliness broke through the walls he had built around himself. She held him the way her father would have held him if Robert Chen had lived long enough to find him. She held him because some wounds could not be healed with medals or ceremonies or speeches. Some wounds could only be healed with presence, with witness, with the simple act of being held by someone who understood. When she finally stepped back, her dress uniform was damp with his tears. She had not wiped them away. They were sacred, those tears, evidence of a healing that had been 55 years in coming. "Sergeant Major," she said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." The old man looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. His face was wet, his hands still trembling, but something had changed in his bearing. Something had shifted. The weight was still there, would always be there, but it no longer seemed to be crushing him quite so completely. "Ask," he said, "when was the last time you ate a full meal?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the memorial wall, to the names that had been his only companions for 6 years. "Harold brings me things sometimes. Sandwiches, fruit, water. That is not what I asked. When was the last time you sat at a table and ate a full meal?" The silence stretched. Behind them, Caston shifted uncomfortably. Darnell remained at attention, his jaw tight with emotion. The ceremony workers had begun moving again, but slowly, quietly, as if afraid to disturb whatever was happening near the wall. "I do not remember," the old man finally admitted. "Ruth used to make Sunday dinners. Boiled rouast, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden." His voice grew distant, lost in memory. "After she died, I stopped eating at tables. Stopped eating much at all. Food does not taste like anything when you are eating alone." General Chun nodded slowly. She turned to face Caston, and her expression hardened into something that made the young officer take an involuntary step backward. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the cold authority of command. "What exactly was happening here when I arrived?" Caston's mouth opened and closed. His face had gone from pale to ashen. There was a report of a vagrant. I was just following protocol, clearing the area before the ceremony." "You were clearing a Medal of Honor recipient from a veteran's cemetery on Memorial Day." General Chun let the words hang in the air. "You were threatening to arrest one of the most decorated soldiers in American history for the crime of visiting his fallen brothers." "I do not know." The words came out strangled. "How could I have known? You could have looked." General Chin stepped closer, and Caston seemed to shrink with every inch she advanced. "You could have listened. You could have treated him like a human being instead of an obstacle to be removed." She stopped directly in front of him, her 2 stars gleaming in the morning light. "Do you know what the Medal of Honor represents, officer?" Caston shook his head mutely. "It represents valor above and beyond the call of duty. It represents actions so courageous, so selfless, that they defy belief. There are only 63 living recipients in this country. 63 men and women who did something so extraordinary that the President of the United States personally authorized their recognition." She paused. "And you're going to handcuff one of them for talking to his dead friends." Darnell spoke up, his voice hoarse. "General, if I may, my partner did not know. None of us knew until we saw the medal. This man does not exactly advertise who he is." General Chun turned to look at the old man. "No, he does not, because men like him never do. They carry their service quietly, privately, without expectation of recognition or reward." She walked back to stand beside him. "That is what makes what happened here today so important. Not because of who he is, but because of who he represents. Every homeless veteran you see on these streets could be carrying a burden like this. Every person in worn clothes and broken shoes could have stories that would bring you to your knees. You do not get to decide who deserves dignity based on how they look. The old man reached out and touched her arm. That is enough, General. He made a mistake. We all make mistakes. General Chun looked at him with something approaching wonder. You are defending him? After everything he said to you? I have heard worse. The old man almost smiled. And I have done worse. Judgment is not my place. It never has been. Harold Brennan stepped forward, clutching his cap against his chest. General Qin, Mom, if I may, I have watched this man for 6 years. He has never asked for anything, never complained, never made trouble. He just comes here to be with his brothers, to keep his promise. His voice cracked. He is the most decent man I have ever known, and I have known a lot of men in my time. General Chun was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the memorial wall, at the flags, at the ceremony preparations that had resumed around them, at the old man standing in the morning light with tears still drying on his weathered cheeks. Then she made a decision. Sergeant Major Thornberry, there is a seat reserved at the front of today's ceremony. It was meant for a distinguished veteran who could not attend. I would like you to have it. The old man shook his head immediately. I cannot. Look at me. I'm not fit for a ceremony. I would shame the uniform. You could never shame the uniform. General Chin's voice was firm. You honor it simply by being alive, by continuing to carry what you carry, by keeping your promise to your brothers every single day for 6 years. She reached out and took his scarred hand in hers. My father would have wanted you there. Wes would have wanted you there. And I want you there. Please. The old man looked at her. Then at Darnell, who gave a small nod of encouragement. Then at Harold, whose eyes were wet with hope. Then at the memorial wall, at the 7 names that had been his only family for so long. I do not have anything to wear, he said quietly. General Chin smiled. A real smile. The first one she had allowed herself since arriving. Sergeant Major, she said, you are wearing the Medal of Honor. You are dressed better than anyone who will be there today. She squeezed his hand. Will you honor us with your presence? The silence stretched. The morning sun climbed higher. And somewhere, perhaps, 7 men who had died on a mountain in Vietnam were watching, waiting, hoping their brother would finally take the first step toward coming home. Wes told me to live, the old man whispered. Maybe this is what he meant. Maybe it is, General Chin replied. Maybe it is time to find out. The walk from Memorial Wall to the ceremony pavilion was only 200 yards. For Ezekiel Thornberry, it felt like the longest journey of his life. General Chun walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his elbow, guiding him forward with a touch that was both gentle and unwavering. Darnell followed a few steps behind, his posture rigid with respect. Harold Brennan walked alongside him, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. And Officer Caston brought up the rear, silent, pale, looking like a man who had just watched his entire understanding of the world collapse in on itself. The ceremony workers stopped what they were doing as the procession passed. One by one, they set down their chairs and their programs and their decorations. One by one, they turned to watch the old man in the worn jacket walking toward the pavilion with a 2-star general at his side. They did not know who he was. They did not understand what was happening, but they could feel it. They could sense the weight of the moment, the gravity of whatever had transpired near the memorial wall. A young woman with a clipboard approached General Chun. Ma'am, we were not expecting you for another hour. The preparations are not complete. Should we accelerate the timeline? General Chun shook her head. Take your time. Everything is exactly as it should be. She gestured toward the front row of chairs that had been set up facing the small stage. Is the reserved seating ready? Yes, ma'am. Front row center. The young woman's eyes flickered to the old man, curiosity and confusion warring on her face. Should I prepare an additional seat? That seat, General Chun said quietly, indicating the chair in the exact center of the front row, the one marked with a small placard reading reserved for distinguished veteran. That seat now belongs to Sergeant Major Ezekiel Thornberry, Medal of Honor recipient, 101st Airborne Division, Hamburger Hill. The young woman's clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered against the ground. She made no move to pick it up. Her eyes had gone wide, her mouth slightly open, her entire body frozen in the particular stillness of someone who has just encountered something they never expected to see outside of history books. "The Medal of Honor recipient," she whispered. "The one from the textbooks. The 11 carries." "The same," General Chen confirmed. She bent down, retrieved the clipboard, and handed it back to the stunned young woman. "I trust this information will remain confidential until the ceremony begins. Sergeant Major Thornberry does not seek recognition. He has simply agreed to honor us with his presence." The young woman nodded mutely. She backed away slowly, still staring at the old man, as if he might disappear if she looked away. Then she turned and hurried toward a group of other workers, and Ezekiel could see her whispering urgently, could see the ripple of reaction spreading through the crowd as word of his identity began to spread. "I do not like attention," he said quietly to General Chen. "I never have. I know." She guided him toward the front row. "But sometimes attention is not about what we like. Sometimes it is about what others need. These people need to see you, Sergeant Major. They need to know that heroes are real, that sacrifice is real, that the names on that wall belong to men who had brothers who loved them and still love them 55 years later." They reached the front row. The chair in the center was simple, identical to all the others, distinguished only by the small placard that bore words he had never sought and never wanted. "Distinguished Veteran," as if what he had done could be captured in 2 words on a piece of cardstock. General Chen removed the placard and handed it to an aide. "He does not need a sign," she said. "Everyone will know who he is soon enough." Ezekiel lowered himself into the chair slowly. His joints ached. His hip throbbed where the shrapnel had never fully healed. His hands trembled as he rested them on his knees. But for the first time in 6 years, he was sitting somewhere other than a bench at the edge of a cemetery or a patch of ground beneath a tree. For the first time in 6 years, he was sitting among the living instead of the dead. Darnell approached and knelt beside him. "Sir," he said softly, "I want you to know that what happened today, what my partner did, it does not represent all of us. Most of us, we understand. We remember. We honor what you and men like you have done." Ezekiel looked at the young Marine turned police officer. He saw the sincerity in his eyes, the shame he carried for his partner's actions, the desperate need to make amends for something that was not his fault. "You served," Ezekiel said. "You lost brothers. You came home, and you kept serving in a different way." He reached out and placed a scarred hand on Darnell's shoulder. "That is all any of us can do, son. Keep serving. Keep trying. Keep remembering." Darnell's eyes glistened. "Thank you, sir. Do not thank me. Thank the men who did not come home. Thank the ones whose names are on that wall. I am just the one who carried them. They are the ones who deserve the thanks." From behind them came the sound of footsteps. Caston approached, his movements hesitant, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He stopped a few feet away, clearly uncertain whether he was welcome. Ezekiel looked at him for a long moment. Then he gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit down, son." Caston blinked. "Sir? Sit down. The ceremony will start soon. You should have a good seat. After what I said to you, after what I did." Ezekiel almost smiled. "I have had men try to kill me for 5 days straight on a mountain in Vietnam. I have held my best friend while he bled to death in my arms. I have buried a wife and slept under trees and talked to ghosts for 6 years." He paused. "You call me names and threaten to arrest me. That barely registers, son." Caston stood frozen. His jaw worked silently. Then, slowly, he moved to the chair beside Ezekiel and sat down. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wet. "I am sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I am so sorry. I know. How can you forgive me so easily?" Ezekiel turned to look at him. "Because forgiveness is not about what you deserve. It is about what I can carry. And I have carried enough anger for one lifetime." He looked back toward the memorial wall, toward the 7 names that watched over everything. "Wes forgave me for not saving him. The least I can do is forgive you for not knowing who I was." Caston had no response. He sat in silence, tears streaming down his face, next to a man he had tried to arrest 30 minutes earlier. and something in him, something hard and bitter and blind, began to crack. The ceremony workers continued their preparations around them. The flags rippled in the morning breeze. And Ezekiel Thornberry sat in the front row of a Memorial Day ceremony for the first time in 55 years, waiting to honor the brothers he had never stopped carrying. The crowd began arriving an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. They came in small groups at first, families carrying flowers and small flags, veterans wearing caps embroidered with the names of ships and divisions and wars that had shaped their lives, children holding their parents' hands, too young to understand what Memorial Day meant, but old enough to sense that something important was happening. Ezekiel watched them file past, finding their seats, greeting neighbors and friends, settling into the rhythms of communal mourning that marked this day every year. He had watched these ceremonies from a distance for 6 years, hidden among the trees at the edge of the cemetery, close enough to hear the speeches but far enough to remain invisible. He had never imagined sitting among them, had never believed he belonged. General Chun had taken her place on the small stage, conferring with her aides about the program. The mayor had arrived, a portly man with a politician's smile who worked the crowd with practiced ease. Local dignitaries filled the seats reserved for them. News cameras had been positioned at the back, ready to capture the proceedings for the evening broadcast. And still the crowd grew. Word had spread, as word always does in small communities. Something had happened near the memorial wall. Something involving the homeless man who visited every day. Something that had made a 2-star general cry. The details were vague, contradictory, impossible to verify. But the rumors drew people like moths to flame. Darnell had positioned himself at the end of Ezekiel's row, standing at parade rest, his posture communicating clearly that he was guarding something precious. Other veterans in the crowd had noticed. They studied the old man in the worn jacket with increasing curiosity, their eyes lingering on the hint of pale blue visible at his collar, their faces shifting as understanding began to dawn. One of them approached. He was perhaps 70 years old, wearing a cap that identified him as a Vietnam veteran, his chest decorated with pins and ribbons that spoke of service in another era. He stopped at the edge of the front row and looked at Ezekiel with an expression that mixed recognition with disbelief. "Sergeant Major Thornberry," he said softly. "Is it really you?" Ezekiel looked up at him. The face was familiar, though aged beyond easy recognition. The eyes were the same, though. The eyes never changed. "Do I know you, soldier?" The old veteran's voice cracked. "Patterson, sir. Thomas Patterson. You carried me off Hill 937. May 20th, 1969. I was hit in the first barrage. You dragged me 60 yards through fire to the medic station." His hands were trembling. "I never got to thank you. By the time I was evac'd, you were already back on the line. And then afterward, nobody could find you. You just disappeared." Ezekiel stared at him. Patterson, the kid from Ohio, the one with the newborn daughter, the one he had carried first, before all the others, because he had been closest and his screams had been loudest. "You survived," Ezekiel whispered. "Because of you." Patterson's tears were flowing freely now. "I have a daughter because of you. 3 grandchildren. A life. All because you came back for me when everyone else was running for cover." He reached out and took Ezekiel's hand in both of his own. He held it like a man holding something sacred, something precious beyond measure. "I have been looking for you for 55 years, Patterson said. "I came to this ceremony today because my grandson is giving a reading, and here you are, sitting in the front row, like God himself arranged it." The commotion drew attention. Other veterans in the crowd began moving closer, drawn by the emotional exchange, curious about what was happening. And as they approached, as they saw the pale blue ribbon now fully visible against Ezekiel's chest, as they heard Patterson speaking the words Hamburger Hill and 11 carries and Medal of Honor, the energy in the pavilion shifted. It started with one man, a Korean War veteran in his 90s who had seen things in Chosin that still haunted his dreams. He rose from his seat, placed his hand over his heart, and stood at attention facing Ezekiel. Then another, a Gulf War veteran in his 50s, his left sleeve pinned empty where an arm used to be. Then another, and another, and another. Within minutes, every veteran in the crowd was standing. Some at attention, some saluting, some simply standing with tears streaming down their faces, paying tribute to a man whose name they had learned in training, whose actions they had studied as examples of what courage looked like when it had no limits. The civilians in the crowd rose too, not because they understood the military significance of what they were witnessing, but because they understood the human significance. They understood that something important was happening, something that transcended ceremony and protocol and the usual rhythms of Memorial Day observance. General Chun stepped to the microphone. Her voice carried across the pavilion, steady and clear despite the emotion visible on her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before we begin our formal program, I need to tell you about something that happened this morning. Something that reminds us why we gather on days like this. Something that shows us what honor and sacrifice and quiet dignity truly look like." She paused, gathering herself. 55 years ago, on a mountain in Vietnam called Hill 937, a young sergeant named Ezekiel Thornberry did something impossible. Under continuous enemy fire, over the course of 14 hours, he carried 11 wounded soldiers to safety. 11 men who would have died in the mud if not for his courage. 11 families who exist today because one man refused to leave his brothers behind. The crowd was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on the old man in the front row, who sat with his head bowed, his scarred hands folded in his lap, his shoulders trembling slightly. For his actions that day, General Chun continued. Sergeant Major Thornberry was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration our nation can bestow. But he did not seek recognition. He did not seek fame. He carried the weight of that day quietly, privately, for more than half a century. And for the past 6 years, he has come to this cemetery every single day to visit the brothers he could not save, to keep a promise he made on that mountain, to honor the men whose names are carved into that wall. She stepped away from the microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. Her eyes met Ezekiel's. "Sergeant Major Thornberry, on behalf of the United States Army, on behalf of every soldier who has ever served, on behalf of my father, Robert Chun, whose life you saved on that mountain." She raised her hand in a salute that was parade ground perfect. "Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for teaching us what it means to never leave a brother behind." The applause that followed was like thunder. It rolled across the cemetery grounds, echoing off the memorial wall, filling the morning air with a sound that might have been heard all the way to a mountain in Vietnam where 7 men had given everything they had. And Ezekiel Thornberry, the homeless veteran who had been threatened with arrest an hour earlier, sat in the front row with tears streaming down his face, finally receiving the recognition he had spent 55 years trying to escape. The applause continued for nearly 3 minutes. Ezekiel did not move. He sat with his head bowed, his scarred hands gripping his knees, his entire body trembling with emotions he'd spent 55 years trying to bury. The sound washed over him like a wave, like the roar of helicopter rotors, like the thunder of artillery on a mountain that existed now only in his nightmares and his memories. When it finally subsided, General Chun spoke again. "Sergeant Major Thornberry, would you be willing to say a few words?" He looked up at her. His face was wet. His eyes held the look of a man who had been pulled from deep water and was still trying to remember how to breathe. "I am not a speaker," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I have not spoken to a crowd in decades." General Chun smiled gently. "Then speak to them the way you speak to your brothers at the wall. Just tell them the truth. The truth." He had carried the truth for so long it had become part of his bones. He had whispered it to granite and stone and the empty air of pre-dawn mornings. He had never spoken it to the living. Slowly, painfully, he rose from his chair. His hips screamed in protest. His legs felt uncertain beneath him. But he stood. He turned to face the crowd, and he began to speak. "I do not deserve this," he said. His voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth out loud was giving him strength he had forgotten he possessed. "I have never deserved any of it. The medal, the recognition, the thanks. He touched the pale blue ribbon at his chest. I did what any soldier would have done. I went back for my brothers. That is all. He paused. The crowd was absolutely silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. But I could not save all of them. There were 7 men I could not reach. 7 men who died on that mountain while I was carrying others to safety. His voice cracked. Wes Drummond was my best friend. He was from Alabama. He played the harmonica, and he sang like an angel, and he made us laugh when we wanted to cry. He died in my arms because I could not get to him in time, because there were always more wounded men closer who needed me first. He looked toward the memorial wall. The 7 names seemed to glow in the morning light. Wes gave me an order before he died. He told me to live, to carry myself the way I had carried the others. He paused. I have been trying to follow that order for 55 years. Most days I fail. Most days, the weight is too heavy and the memories are too loud, and all I want is to be with them again. He turned back to the crowd. His eyes moved across the faces. The veterans who understood. The families who were beginning to understand. The children who would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. I came to this cemetery every day because it was the only place I felt close to them, the only place where the world made sense. I talked to them because I had no one else to talk to. My wife, Ruth, she understood. She was the only one who could quiet the noise in my head. When she died, I lost my anchor. I lost my reason to stay among the living. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. But she would not want this for me. Ruth would not want me sleeping under trees and fading away in the shadows. And West, he gave me an order I have been disobeying for half a century. He straightened, his shoulders squared. For just a moment, the old soldier emerged from beneath the weathered exterior. The man who had carried 11 men through hell. The man who had held a position alone through the night. The man who had earned every ribbon and medal and commendation that the military could bestow. The names on that wall, he said, his voice carrying across the pavilion with sudden strength. They're not just names. They were sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. They had dreams. They had families waiting for them. They had futures that were stolen by war. He pointed toward the memorial. My brothers are there. Wes Drummond, Thomas Patterson. He nodded toward the old veteran who had embraced him earlier. He survived. Marcus Williams, Robert Chun, David Okonkwo, James Whitfield, Samuel Torres. 7 names among hundreds. 7 men who gave everything so that others could live. He paused. The silence was absolute. I carried them off that mountain, but they have been carrying me ever since. Every day I wake up because of them. Every breath I take is a breath they cannot take. Every sunrise I see is a sunrise they will never see. He touched his chest again, pressing his palm against the metal. This does not belong to me. It belongs to them, to the men who did not come home, to the families who waited and prayed and received folded flags instead of hugs. He looked at General Chun, at Darnell, at Caston, who sat with tears streaming down his face, at Patterson, who was openly weeping, at the hundreds of faces turned toward him with expressions of awe and grief and something that looked like love. I did not know why I survived when so many did not. I did not know why I was given 78 years when West only got 23. But I know this. He drew a deep breath. Surviving is not betraying the dead. Living is not forgetting. Ruth taught me that. West ordered me to do it. And maybe, after 55 years, it is time I finally listened. He turned to look at the memorial wall one last time. His lips moved silently, forming words that only he and the dead could hear. Then he turned back to the crowd. Still here, brothers, he said softly. Still trying. And maybe, finally, starting to live. The silence held for 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. Then Patterson stood. He raised his hand in a salute that trembled with age and emotion. Then Darnell. Then Caston, rising on unsteady legs, his hand lifting to his brow in a gesture that seemed to cost him everything he had. Then the veterans, row by row, one by one, every man and woman who had ever worn a uniform rising to their feet, raising their hands, saluting a brother who had carried more than any human should ever have to carry. And finally, the civilians, the families, the children, standing not in salute, but in witness, in honor, in recognition of something sacred that they had been privileged to see. General Chin's voice came over the speakers, thick with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Major Ezekiel Thornberry, Medal of Honor, 101st Airborne Division. American hero. The applause that followed shook the ground beneath their feet. The ceremony continued, but everything had changed. The scheduled speakers delivered their remarks. The honor guard performed their ritual. The names of the fallen were read aloud as they were every year. But the energy was different now. The air itself seemed charged with something electric, something sacred, something that would be talked about in this community for decades to come. Ezekiel sat through it all in a kind of daze. People approached him during breaks in the program. Veterans who wanted to shake his hand. Families who wanted to thank him for his service. Children who stared at his medal with wide eyes and asked their parents what it meant. He responded to each of them with the same quiet grace, the same humble deflection, the same insistence that he had only done what any soldier would have done. But something was different inside him. Something had shifted during his speech. The weight was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer felt like it was crushing him. It felt for the first time in 55 years like something he could carry without being destroyed by it. When the ceremony ended, General Chun found him surrounded by well-wishers. She waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then approached with a look of determination on her face. "Sergeant Major," she said, "I need to speak with you privately. There is something important we need to discuss." She led him away from the pavilion, toward a quiet spot near the edge of the cemetery grounds where the morning sun filtered through the branches of ancient oak trees. Darnell followed at a respectful distance. Caston had disappeared somewhere during the ceremony, unable to face the magnitude of what he had done and what he had witnessed. "I made some calls during the program," General Chun said. "To Washington, to the VA, to some people I know who specialize in helping veterans who have fallen through the cracks." Ezekiel shook his head. "I do not need help. I have managed on my own for 6 years. With respect, Sergeant Major, managing and living are not the same thing." General Chin's voice was gentle but firm. "You have been surviving, existing, waiting to die so you could join your brothers. That is not what West ordered you to do." He had no response to that. She was right, and they both knew it. "There is a program," she continued. "Not the VA. Something smaller, more personal. It is run by a retired colonel named Sarah Hendricks. She served in Iraq, lost her legs to an IED, spent 3 years living on the streets before she found her way back. Now she helps other veterans do the same." Ezekiel looked at her skeptically. "I am 78 years old. What kind of program would want me? The kind that understands what you carry. The kind that knows you cannot fix 55 years of pain with paperwork and pills." She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a card. "Colonel Hendricks runs a residential program about 30 miles from here. Small group, all combat veterans. They work through things together, support each other, learn how to live again." He took the card, turned it over in his scarred hands. The words seemed to blur before his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You have a ceremony to oversee, dignitaries to entertain, a career to manage. Why spend your time on an old man who has been talking to ghosts for 6 years?" General Chun was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Because my father spent the last years of his life trying to find you. Because he died believing he had failed you by not being there when you needed someone. Because he made me promise that if I ever had the chance to help you, I would not hesitate." She paused. "And because West gave you an order, Sergeant Major. It is time someone helped you follow it." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. Harold Brennan approached. His weathered face creased with concern. "Sergeant Major," he said, "there is someone here who wants to meet you." He hesitated. "Actually, there are about 50 people who want to meet you. But this one I think you should see first." He led them back toward the memorial wall, where a small group had gathered. As they approached, the crowd parted, revealing a young woman in her early 30s. She had dark hair and Asian features and eyes that sparkled with tears she was trying not to shed. "Sergeant Major Thornberry?" Her voice trembled. "My name is Jennifer Chin Patterson." She gestured to the old veteran standing beside her. "This is my grandfather, Thomas Patterson, the man you saved on Hamburger Hill. Ezekiel stared at her. Patterson's granddaughter. The newborn baby in the photograph that Patterson had shown him on that mountain. The photograph that had fallen from his pocket when the first shell hit. My grandfather has told me about you my entire life, Jennifer continued. How you came back for him. How you dragged him through fire. How you saved his life so he could have a family. She stepped forward and took his hand. I exist because of you. My children exist because of you. 3 generations of our family exist because you did not leave him behind. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a young soldier holding a baby, his face split in a wide grin, his eyes filled with joy and terror and hope. This is the photograph he carried on that mountain, the one that fell out when he was hit. She pressed it into Ezekiel's hands. He has kept it for 55 years. He wanted you to have it now, so you would know that what you did mattered, that the life you saved became many lives. Ezekiel looked at the photograph, at the young face of a soldier he had carried first, at the baby who had grown into a woman standing before him now, at the proof, tangible and undeniable, that his actions on that mountain had rippled forward through time in ways he had never imagined. The tears came then, not the quiet tears of grief he had shed at the wall for 6 years. These were different. These were the tears of a man who was finally beginning to understand that survival was not a burden, that living was not a betrayal, that the weight he carried could become something other than a curse. General Chun placed a hand on his shoulder. This is why you need to live, Sergeant Major. Not for yourself. For them. For everyone whose life exists because of what you did. For the grandchildren of the men you saved. For the futures you made possible. He looked at her, then at Jennifer, then at Patterson, who was weeping openly, his aged face transformed by joy and gratitude and a love that had waited 55 years to be expressed. Wes told me to live, Ezekiel said softly. Maybe this is what he meant. General Chin squeezed his shoulder. Maybe it is time to find out. 3 months later, Ezekiel Thornberry stood at the memorial wall as the first light of dawn touched the granite. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and approaching winter. The flags hung motionless in the still morning, and the names carved into the stone seemed to glow with a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. He was clean now, showered, shaved, wearing clothes that fit properly for the first time in 6 years. The program at Colonel Hendrick's facility had given him a small room with a bed and a window that looked out over rolling hills. It was more space than he needed, more comfort than he had allowed himself in half a decade. But he was learning, slowly, to accept it. Good morning, brothers, he said softly, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. It has been a while since I came at dawn. They keep me busy at the program. Group sessions, individual therapy, learning to talk about things I have never talked about before. He reached out and touched Wes's name. His fingers traced the familiar letters, the grooves worn smooth by years of daily contact. I'm trying, Wes. Really trying this time. Not just surviving. Living. Like you ordered. His voice caught. It is hard. Some days, it is the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than carrying men through fire. Harder than holding you while you died. Because living means feeling everything I spent 55 years trying to bury. He was quiet for a moment. The cemetery was empty except for him. Harold Brennan would not arrive to unlock the gates for another hour, but Colonel Hendricks had arranged special access. She understood that some rituals were sacred. Some promises could not be broken, even by healing. They're the young kid at the program, Ezekiel continued. Marine, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Lost his best friend to a sniper in Helmand province. He does not talk much, does not eat much. Reminds me of myself 55 years ago. He paused. I have been sitting with him, not saying anything, just being there, letting him know he is not alone, that someone understands. A bird sang somewhere in the trees. The sun climbed higher, painting the memorial wall in shades of gold and amber. I told him about you, Wes. About how you gave me an order I could not follow for half a century. About how carrying guilt for the men we cannot save will destroy us if we let it. He almost smiled. He did not say anything back, but he looked at me, really looked, and I think maybe he heard. He stepped back from the wall. His eyes moved across the 7 names. West, Patterson, who had survived, Williams, Chun, Okonkwo, Whitfield, Torres, his brothers, his burden, his purpose. I am not going to stop coming here, he said. You know that. But it is different now. I'm not coming to wait for death anymore. I am coming to tell you about life, about the people I am meeting, the veterans I am helping, the weight I am learning to share instead of carry alone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a harmonica, tarnished with age, dented from years of use, but still capable of making music. Colonel Hendricks had found it at an antique store, had given it to him without explanation, had somehow known what it would mean. I cannot play like you did, West. Never could, but I am learning. The other guys at the program, they say I sound like a dying cat. He laughed softly, a real laugh, the first one in years. But I keep trying, because you love music, because it kept us human in the jungle, because maybe, if I play long enough, you will hear it wherever you are. He raised the harmonica to his lips and played a few halting notes. The sound was rough, untrained, nothing like the sweet melodies West used to coax from the instrument. But it was music. It was memory. It was a promise kept in the only way he knew how. When he finished, the silence seemed different, fuller, more alive. I have to go, brothers. Group session starts in an hour. There's a new guy coming today. Afghanistan vet. Lost both legs. Angry at the world. Does not think anyone can understand what he is going through. He tucked the harmonica back into his pocket. I'm going to tell him about you. About all of you. About what it means to carry something so heavy you think it will crush you. And about how carrying it together makes it lighter. He touched the wall one more time. A gesture of farewell. A gesture of love. A gesture that had been refined by 6 years of daily repetition into something as natural as breathing. Still here, brothers. Still trying. And finally, after 55 years, starting to live. He turned and walked toward the cemetery entrance. His step was steadier now, his shoulders straighter. The limp was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He was more than his wounds, more than his guilt, more than the weight he had carried for half a century. At the gate, a car was waiting. Darnell Washington leaned against the hood, 2 cups of coffee steaming in his hands. He had made it a habit to drive Ezekiel to his dawn visits whenever his shift allowed. A small act of service, a way of honoring the man he had met on the worst morning of his career. How are they doing? Darnell asked, handing over one of the cups. Ezekiel took it, wrapped his scarred hands around the warmth. Same as always. Quiet, patient, waiting. Waiting for what? For me to finish what I started. To live the life they gave me. To make their sacrifice mean something. Darnell nodded slowly. And are you? Making it mean something? Ezekiel looked back at the memorial wall, at the names that would be there long after he was gone, at the brothers who had carried him through 55 years of darkness and were now carrying him towards something that looked almost like light. I'm trying, he said. Every day, I'm trying. They drove in comfortable silence toward the program facility, where other broken soldiers waited, where other weights needed sharing, where the work of living continued one difficult day at a time. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we do not always recognize, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments below, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who carries a weight that others cannot see? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they're the ones we pass on the street without a second glance. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you meet is carrying something. Be kind, be patient, and never forget that some weights are easier to bear when we carry them together. The sun climbed higher over the veterans' cemetery. The flag stirred in a gentle breeze. And somewhere, perhaps, 7 men who had died on a mountain in Vietnam smiled down at a brother who had finally learned to live. Still here, still trying, and no longer alone.